Okay, final speaker then is Emma Pinchbeck, who's the relatively new Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee. We heard a little bit yesterday about the 7th carbon budget, and Emma's going to be able to talk in more detail and more expansively about that. It's a really important piece of work for those of us interested in the agri-food system and getting to net zero by 2050. Emma's got a very interesting background career. She was head of Climate Change and Energy at WWF UK. She was the Deputy CEO at the trade body Renewable UK from, when was that, 2016 to 2020? She was Chief Executive of Energy UK from 2020 to 2024, and now she's at the Climate Change Committee. So I invited Emma along and was responsible for hosting her, making sure she was here all right this morning. And I was just doing a little bit of research, preparing for the introductory comments, and I found a piece in The Guardian which had a little CV, and it said, phrases she overuses. Sorry, but I'm running late, which, caused me some anxiety. But here, perfectly on time, Emma Pinchbeck.
It's remarkable. That might be the only thing about this that goes well, actually, but we get to find out in live time. Hello, I'm about 120 days in. As you can see from my bio, my specialism is energy transition, although at WWF I did some work on land use change, and I'm the great-granddaughter of a tenant farmer. So my granny is one of 7, and all her brothers still farm, and I grew up overlooking their dairy herd in Gloucestershire. So it's quite nice for me coming back to this sector. That's a long way of excusing myself for all the complicated questions on land use, because we also have our expert on land use in the audience, Ruth, at the back, who you should definitely hobble at some point, and we can direct really difficult questions to. But in the meantime, I'll take you through the carbon budget. This is hot off the press. We published it 2 weeks ago, so you're one of the first audiences that's getting it presented to you. If you don't know what the Climate Change Committee is, we're the independent statutory body that advises government on the UK carbon budgets. The carbon budgets are caps on emissions over 5-year periods in the economy. We normally set a carbon budget about 10 to 12 years out from its actual delivery date. And I'm a big fan of them, having worked both in the private sector and the environmental movement, because I think they provide clear direction on how you tackle climate change. They meet our international climate change commitments, but also they're pretty open in terms of the technologies and the pathways that actually deliver emissions reduction. And by that I mean they're not technology prescriptive. We have been surprised over the past 10 years about which technologies have come through and delivered emissions reduction, but we have nevertheless met the carbon budgets. And I love that combination of certainty and technology agnosticism. As well as the carbon budget, it's important for this audience that we recognise there are 2 committees in the confusingly, singularly titled Climate Change Committee, one of which looks after mitigation and the carbon budgets, the other of which looks after adaptation. We have a very big adaptation report coming next year, which is the equivalent to the carbon budget. We do it about every 4 years, looking at climate risk and resilience. And some of the measures I'll talk to you about today, things like tree planting and peatland restoration and land use change, also have relevance for that other committee, and where possible we try and align work there. And lastly, also relevant and not on the slides, we do this for the UK government, but we also do it for all devolved nations. So we are about to advise Northern Ireland next week, but also Wales and Scotland. And as you can imagine, some of the advice on land use and farming looks quite, well, not spectacularly different, but slightly different in emphasis in those nations. And so that's been fascinating too. We also have a role in advising on the international climate targets. So we did the modelling for the recent NDC, which is the nationally determined contribution or international target. And we do work with 26 other international climate change committees around the world to kind of work on best practice for mitigation and adaptation too. So that's us. This is the carbon budget. That purple block at the end is the new carbon budget, hot off the press. It's an 87% reduction of emissions in the UK economy against 1990 levels. It takes us nicely through the brand new UK NDCs, which involve a 81% reduction for emissions against 1990 levels, which is that black line on the chart there for 2035. And also, we, alongside publishing the threshold for the carbon budget, publish a pathway to how you might deliver it, and that's the bright purple line you can see there. Every time we do a carbon budget, we update our advice and that pathway. And so if you're familiar at all with the net zero target and the advice that went with that, The advice we offered last week effectively displaces it where there's overlap, because technologies change and improve. You know, we learn new things in a 5-year period. I can come on to where some of the differences are in a moment. The yellow blocks, just to show you, are the previous carbon budgets which we've met, and it's important to say we've met them. The UK was the first G7 country to demonstrate you could do emissions reduction at the same time as growing your economy. It was also the first G7 country to swap coal out of its energy mix and instead replace it with renewables. And we've halved emissions against 1990 levels. And again, I think that's testament to the really strong governance we have, but also the agnosticism about which technologies might come forward and which solutions might deliver for us. That's the yellow blocks. And the pinkish blocks are the ones that are underway. Let's talk less about those, apart from to say that the government is currently off track on delivery. I can see a civil servant at the back of the room. And there's about a third of a gap between the policies needed to deliver the legislated carbon budgets, those pink ones, and what the government have produced to date. But it is a brand new government, so there's still time. This shows you where emissions come from in the economy and where we're going. So the bar on the far left shows you the first 3 carbon budgets. And all you need to really focus on here, if you can't read the writing, is that bright yellow chunk at the bottom is the power sector. And the 50% emissions reduction across the economy to date has largely been delivered by decarbonising power. And that has, again, largely come from moving off from coal and in some cases from gas and replacing it with low carbon generation, particularly offshore wind, onshore wind and solar. And again, just to describe the way the carbon budgets work, I promise you that when we were setting the first 3 carbon budgets, because I was there, none of us thought that offshore wind would be the flagship technology for decarbonising the energy mix, but that is what has happened. We did, though, think that we'd have to do power first. And so what you see is from the first 3 carbon budgets into the next 3, which is the period we're in now, the second column along, power is a much smaller share of the overall emissions. And for the period ahead, the big sources of concern where emissions most come from in the economy are the bright purple block and the bright orange block. And those are surface transport, which is a fancy way of saying cars and vans, mainly. This is economist language. And also the orange block, which is buildings. And that, again, is largely from the fact that we use gas to heat our homes. And so for policymakers, that's the focus. That said, for this conference, you can see the lines at the top. And all the way through this presentation, if you focus on the bright green, anywhere, that's agriculture. And what you start to see in this period is agriculture becoming, and land use becoming a bigger share of the emissions. And the dark black chunk at the top is engineered removals, where we are mechanically removing carbon dioxide from the economy. This column, the third column along, is the carbon budget that we've just published. And then the last column, importantly, shows that as we move beyond 2040, proportionally agriculture, land use and removals become a much bigger share of the remaining emissions in the economy, almost half of our emissions. So I think the story is we need to start on the solutions today to mitigate emissions from agriculture and land use later in the decade, but also that we are expecting to see residual emissions from 2040 in the carbon budgets. This is another way of looking at the problem by sector. So when we're thinking about how we might meet that carbon budget, we go sector by sector across the economy. And all of these lines are a different sector in the economy. And for the 7th carbon budget period here, out to 2040, this chart on the left shows the 6 highest emitting sectors. Again, you can see that bright green line is in there as one of the most emitting sectors today. Agriculture, I think, is 3rd or 4th. Oddly, in the carbon budget, it says 4th. Looking at Ruth, but on this bar chart, it looks like 3rd. But it's close with industry in the rankings. The biggest share of emissions is surface transport, and this shows you what we expect to happen to emissions across the period. So going from where emissions are reduced to what we're going to see. I mean, this might be not good news for all of you, but the really exciting thing for me in the carbon budget is what happens in surface transport. And that bright purple line there falls so quickly because we're expecting to see electric vehicles come into the market before 2030 and then rapidly cannibalise internal combustion engine vehicles. So I suppose it is relevant to all of you if you drive a car, but by 2040 we're expecting to see something like 3/4 of all cars on the road being electric, 2/3 of vans. And that electrification story is also relevant for things like farm machinery and heavy goods vehicles. As a change from where we were in carbon budget 6, I'd say where we think we can electrify something, we're now doing it. And that applies even in processes in agriculture or industry where we were saying, oh, maybe it'll be hydrogen or something else. Electricity is a really powerful story. Again, the red line shows you a similar story, but for buildings, where that red line reduction is coming from electrifying heat. And then for agriculture and for aviation, which are trickier sectors, we're starting to decarbonise across this period, but it's going slower than some other sectors of the economy. And the other thing to draw your attention to is what happens in other sectors, because I'll come back to it in a minute. But the emissions from agriculture decline slowly, but also we start to build in sinks from land. And by that I mean we start to plant more trees, restore peatlands, and build engineered removals in the economy. And that black line is engineered removals, so they start to grow across this period. And also you can see that the land use sink grows out to 2040 and is really significant beyond that. And that is, I have been promising audiences possibly one of the most interesting things about this carbon budget. And I know it's pre-lunch, but this chart is very exciting. Because there's a change in how we've done the carbon budget analysis this time. The team have looked at agriculture as part of a land use challenge rather than separate from it. And I think if you're from the farming community, what that means is we're treating land managers and farmers as the people that can provide solutions, as well as just thinking about agriculture as a problem in that it's an emitter. And I'll show you what that looks like in terms of the solutions we recommend. But when you stack that up in the model, what we've essentially tried to do is net off the remaining emissions from agriculture with investment in nature-based solutions for trapping carbon and for removing emissions from the wider economy. So the dark green chunk under there is the removals from land and from nature, and the bright green chunk is agriculture, and you can see they balance each other out. If you're interested in how removals work across the wider economy, we also make aviation responsible for paying for the expensive removals technologies on a similar principle. So they're allowed to keep emitting so long as they're investing in SAF and in direct air carbon capture and storage and bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, which are mechanical removals. And that's what the purple chart is. See, I told you it was fun. You don't look convinced. Bear with me. The other way of thinking about emissions reduction across the carbon budget period is to think about it by household. And so what the team have done here is aggregate up all the emissions reductions in terms of household choices. And again, I think there's a lot in the press and the media around diet. And of course, diet is a significant factor for agriculture and how we've thought about it. And I will cover that to death in a moment. But when you think about the wider carbon budget and the challenges for the next 10 years, if you're a policymaker and you're thinking about households, I'd be much more focused on heat decarbonisation and transport decarbonisation, and basically how we make it possible for people to get electric vehicles. Looks like the market might do that for us, or to get heat pumps where people will need considerable help in accessing these technologies. And those two technologies are responsible for over 70% of the emissions reduction from a householder's point of view. That said, there are some behaviour changes in there, changes to diet in particular, which do matter, and you can see the dietary change in there. At the bottom, it's the land use change from reduction in meat and dairy. It's only about 1% of the choice that you can make as a householder, but it's still significant for what it means for agriculture. Diet. So there has been a lot of coverage of diet, so I just thought I'd talk to you a little bit about how we've thought about that. This is a trend line for dietary change over the last 5 years, and then what we're assuming the carbon budget, showing you both meat and dairy here. The dietary change in the carbon budget, and a statistic that went around the world, is we're expecting about a 130 grams change in meat eating, as in reducing your meat intake, by 2040, which is worth 2 large doner kebabs. The 2 large doner kebabs thing made lots of headlines, but it's a useful way of thinking about the overall portion of meat we're talking about. It's not massive, but it is significant. And that's a reduction of about, I think, 25% and then a third of meat and dairy by 2050. But we're following existing dietary trends here. So this black line on the left shows you that we've had a reduction in meat eating in particular of around 9 to 10% since the early 2020s. And we've started our trend line slightly above that because it dropped off even more sharply over the last couple of years. We think that's probably the cost of living. Meat is expensive and other food purchases are down too. But nevertheless, it's interesting that already people are making choices away from meat In the modelling, we don't assume we do anything to kind of continue that trend line down. We assume we make alternatives more available, which includes vegetables. In the farming modelling, we've got more room for arable farming, for example, but it's also alternative proteins and making them cheaper, tastier, more attractive, and that is it to get us that trend line. Yes. I wanted to show you, though, that we do have to do something about livestock, and there's no point in kind of ducking it. Livestock is directly we can attribute about 63% of agricultural emissions to livestock. That's from the digestion process, but also for things like waste and manure management. The other emissions on farm for things like machinery use are proportionally much smaller. And you also have the indirect emissions for things like fertiliser on grassland. So it's a significant problem. When you break it down, in the UK, ruminants are the biggest source of that within that assumption about livestock as well. So we actually make individual species changes in the model for things like lamb or beef and poultry farming with slightly different rates of change across the period ahead. And that means that even if you go as far as you can to eliminate emissions from other areas of farming, we do have to get that change in livestock emissions. But I thought I'd talk to you about like how far we've pushed the model on everything else as well. So for farmers, we've suggested things like feed additives. You've probably talked about those today. So and livestock breeding changes, earlier slaughter, that kind of thing. We've talked about more efficient uses of fertiliser, reduced fertilisers, cover crops. We've talked about better waste management, things like caps on slurry sites and use of more AD. And we've also fully electrified where we can or used hydrogen for farm machinery. And it's worth saying we can almost get 100% emissions abatement out of farming processes that require machinery, just like we can for energy across the economy. But even so, it's a relatively small proportion. You can see the emission savings in orange there relative to what you get from livestock. And this makes the same point again, but just kind of breaks that out further. So you can see, I like this pie chart on the right, where you can see machinery here is about 30%, low carbon farming practices, those other things I talked about 20%, and the reduction in livestock numbers being about 46% of the share of emissions reduction for the agriculture emissions reduction in 2040. This chart always kind of rats people's brains. We have, in the interest of fairness, also shown you what it looks like the other way. So we've modelled it assuming there's no dietary change, and you can see that on the left here. And you get not even half the emissions reduction with doing no dietary change, but that orange block shows you what it looks like with just all of those other measures. Now, really importantly, and I suppose more positively, because we've modelled everything all together as one system, the other really important thing about the change in livestock is it frees up land to do other things, and the other things get you that dark green bit on the chart I showed you earlier. So although the direct emissions from livestock is significant, perhaps more significant is something like 60% of the land that we need freed up to do other things for the economy comes from that livestock change as well. And rather than using the land for livestock farming, we're also planting more broadleaf woodlands, we're doing more hedgerow restoration, we have got more cropland in the model, and we've also got bioenergy crop for VEX and removals technologies. And for farmers, that means that we've thought about additional revenues. So as we're removing livestock out of the land, we're freeing up land, and that's the land we use to do other measures, and then we're thinking about how to finance those other measures for farmers and land users. And when you put all that together, it looks like this. So you get less meat and dairy consumption, leading to a reduction in livestock numbers. That leads to less grassland needed for grazing, less cropland needed for animal feed. So you get less emissions at both levels from that, directly from livestock, and then the indirect land use emissions. You release land then to do other things, which gives us the land that we need in the models for trees, peat, and hedge creation. And roughly that change in land use is a similar level to what the government have in the land use framework, and I think we're a little bit more conservative, about 10% land use change. And when you add all of that up together, just looking at agricultural emissions, it sort of looks like this. And we've got a chart like this for every area of the economy. So the top line there is what happens if we do nothing in the economy, that dotted line. And we've assumed sort of business as usual on policies and modelled that. And then the purple line is the line that we need to deliver the carbon budgets below. And then this is, if you aggregate all the measures up, what they look like next to each other to deliver that abatement. And all of this shows is the potential for abatement within agriculture. So if you look at peatland restoration and management, that is just the nitrogen changes in the soil as opposed to the wider benefits of then using that peatland for carbon. But nevertheless, it's still the same message really, that reducing livestock numbers is that big chunk at the bottom, low carbon farming practices is the yellow. Really excitingly, the fact that we can electrify so much of stationary and mobile machinery in the red, and then other measures in between. It's a very plausible pathway. It's very similar to what the government have in the land use framework in terms of land use change. And importantly, I don't think anyone else has said this today, but because we try to do this holistically, we think that there is a net benefit to farming and to land managers from doing it. So we modelled something like 12 different farm archetypes in doing this, and that research will be available in the next few weeks, and looked at these changes. Across every single farm, we found a net benefit in terms of either social benefits, things like improved air quality or water quality, things that can be monetised or incentivised with public money, or direct profit to farmers through more efficient yields, through reduced fuel bills for electrification of their machinery and so on. And the net benefit is about £500 to £1,500 per hectare across every single archetype. For folks that are on very intensive grassland farms, that particular archetype, it was more like £650 to £700 per hectare net benefit. Now, that requires civil servants and others monetising the social benefits, the things that are already providing support for under ELMS and previously CAP schemes. But there are also immediate benefits for farmers in some of those efficiency savings. And I think that has been a really important story for us, that we've done lots of work with farming communities and rural communities to work out something that feels not just plausible in that we can find the solutions, but also practical in that they have to work for the farming community. And I think we recognise that is deeply important, particularly now. So I'm going to stop there after that mad canter through land use and farming and agricultural policy. We at the CCC will be rolling out this evidence now. There's 400 pages of it online, should you wish to go further into the modelling, and our modelling reports will all be coming out over the next few months. We'll be advising the devolved nations over the next few weeks, and so there's a lot for you as researchers to get your teeth into, and I know that Ruth and Indra and the rest of the farming and land use team would love to hear from you. So if there are questions now, let me have them, but also if you want to keep in touch with us, please do. Thank you.